Hello, and welcome to the 14th lecture in the history of ancient Rome. The last time we looked at the tumultuous events of the Second Punic War, and we ended with the postscript on the Third Punic War, as it's so called, in which Rome destroyed the city of Carthage in 146 BC. We left Rome then in control of the western half of the Mediterranean Sea, over which they now had unquestioned mastery. What I want to do in this lecture today is examine the rise of Roman power, rapid rise of Roman power in the eastern Mediterranean, the more complex of the two halves of the Mediterranean Sea in ancient times, with, as we've seen, the Hellenistic kingdoms powerful there. We will, as we have done before, outline only very briefly and in broad brushstrokes the main thrust of these wars, and then we will examine the shape of Roman power, the nature of Roman power by the period about 160, 170 BC, with examples, two examples of incidents that I believe are illustrative of the extent of Roman power as it extended over now the entire Mediterranean Sea by about 170 BC. For contemporaries, the emergence of Rome onto the civilized stage, as they would have conceived it, the eastern half of the Mediterranean, was a bewildering event indeed. Polybius, who, as we have seen, was a Greek hostage, held at Rome, although not held in strict confinement, but kept under house arrest of sorts at Rome, but friends of the Cornelii Scipiones, leading family that had produced, for instance, the man who defeated Hannibal, Scipio, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later named Africanus, the conqueror of Africa for his victory over Hannibal in 202 BC. Polybius was well in with this family and managed to observe Roman affairs from first hand. And he was motivated, he tells us, to write his history of Rome at all, specifically to address the question of how the Romans managed what he considered to be a remarkable achievement, the conquest of what he regarded as the entire civilized world in the space of a little over 50 years. He introduces his history with the following statement. There can surely be nobody so petty or so apathetic in his outlook that he has no desire to discover by what means and under what system of government the Romans succeeded in less than 53 years in bringing under their rule almost the whole of the inhabited world, an achievement which is without parallel in human history. That was Polybius's statement of why he wrote his history. And indeed it was a bewildering and remarkable achievement. The Romans were drawn eastward initially with conflicts with Macedon, which is what we look at first. I intend, by the way, to look at Rome's conflicts with the two major eastern powers, Macedon and then Seleucid Syria, in sequence, even though chronologically they overlap somewhat. I want to focus more on the regions rather than adopting a strictly diachronic chronological outline of events, which would, I think, be overly confusing. So let's first of all deal with Rome's involvements with Macedon, then we look at the situation with regard to Syria and the Seleucid kingdom there. Macedon was the first of the Hellenistic kingdoms to draw the close attention of Rome, and really, in many ways, they're responsible for it themselves. Because after the Battle of Cannae in Italy, the king of Macedon, a man called Philip V, who was an ambitious man indeed, made a pact with Hannibal. He figured that after Cannae, Roman power in Italy would be forever broken. So he made overtures to the Carthaginian hero and formed an alliance with Hannibal in 215 BC. For the Romans, this raised a rather harrowing possibility, namely Hannibal being reinforced from across the Adriatic Sea with fully trained, well-equipped Macedonian troops. This may have changed the face of the war in Italy considerably had it happened. Remarkably, even though they were in the depths of their despair following the defeat at Cannae and trying to reconstruct their forces after that catastrophe, they rustled up a force and sent it over to Greece in 215 BC. This is called the First Macedonian War, and really it's nothing in particular. It's a series of skirmishes, often the Romans operating by fomenting rebellion among Philip's subjects in northern Greece and on the outskirts of Macedonian territory. After a series of skirmishes, the war came to a negotiated end in 204 BC. So it really was something of a non-event, graced with the title the First Macedonian War. It wasn't really anything in particular. It does reveal something again of the Roman ability, Roman desire to fight an enemy once identified, even when they're in the depths of their troubles with Hannibal. But nevertheless, it wasn't really a major event. The one effect of it, however, was that the Romans had identified a new enemy. They regarded Philip now with considerable suspicion, and they had identified him as a potential problem for the future. Well, the future wasn't too long in coming, because within 15 years, in 200 BC, the Second Macedonian War was underway. This war was brought about predominantly by Rome's allies in the east, Pergamum and Rhodes. We have seen these two Hellenistic states, small buffer states between the major powers of the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria, and the Antigonids in Macedon. These two states had become allies, friends of the Roman people, and they revealed to the Romans around 201 or so BC that Philip had come to an agreement. A non-aggression pact had been signed between Philip of Macedon and King Antiochus III of Seleucid Syria. This was worrisome because it meant that the two traditional enemies of each other might now be joining forces, or at least turning a blind eye to each other's activities in the Mediterranean Sea. Pergamon and Rhodes, both of whom were taking the brunt of Philip V's new aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean, appealed to Rome. The Romans were reluctant to get involved in a further war. They had just finished the Second Punic War. They were exhausted and were most reluctant to get involved in yet another foreign adventure. But when the Pergamene and Rhodian ambassadors revealed this secret pact between Philip and Antiochus, the Romans became fearful and voted to embark on yet another war across the seas. By the way, since this so-called secret pact between Antiochus and Philip was revealed to the Romans by the Pergamenes and the Rhodians, specifically to induce the Romans to intervene in their affairs and to protect them from Philip's aggression in the Eastern Mediterranean, some modern scholars have regarded it as a fiction. They've regarded it as an invention of the ambassadors, of the Eastern ambassadors, to convince Rome to act. Well, whatever the case, the Romans believed that there was a non-aggression pact and voted for war. The Second Macedonian War stretched from 200 BC to 196 and was again fought between Rome and Philip V. The first few years of the war were non-events. The two armies manoeuvring gingerly in the mountainous terrain of Macedon. Diplomatic efforts being made to resolve the war, but nothing decisive happening until, by accident, the two sides bumped into each other in 197 BC around a ridge in Macedon, or at least in northern Greece, called Dog's Head, Cynocephali. The two armies were marching along either side of this ridge, unaware of each other's presence, when scouts on top of the ridge spotted the enemy simultaneously. There was a race for the top of the ridge. Whoever gained the high ground would undoubtedly have the advantage. And the Macedonians got there first. The Roman legions were still forming up in their battle line when the Macedonians came charging down the ridge on top of them and swept all before them. It looked as if the Macedonians and King Philip would be victorious when the Roman army stood firm. Its retreat stopped and they held the Macedonian phalanx in place. At this time, a colonel, the equivalent of a colonel, a man called the tribune of the soldiers, which is a low-ranking officer, on the right wing of the Roman army, observed that the opposite side of the Macedonian army had not fully formed up. He detached several units from his side of the Roman army and assaulted the still unformed left flank of the Macedonian army. He was victorious and then swung his victorious sections of the Roman army around and attacked the rear of the Macedonian phalanx held firm by the main Roman line. It's a fine example of Roman military superiority. And in the next lecture, we'll examine something of the nature of the Roman army, its organizational principles and its tactical abilities and so forth in the next lecture when we seek explanations for the rise of the Roman Empire. The Battle of Cynocephalae, or the Battle of Dog's Head, then is a good example of the superiority of the Roman legions over even so well-trained and well-equipped an armament as the Macedonian phalanx. With his army defeated, Philip was forced to negotiate a peace with the Romans, which he did, and essentially was debarred from interfering again in the affairs of Greece or the Aegean Sea. For the Greeks, south of Macedon, people who'd always felt themselves under the thumbs of the Macedonians, the Second Macedonian War was also important. For the Romans, at the Pan-Hellenic Games at Isthmia in 196 BC, the Romans declared the Greeks free. And in 194, they withdrew all their military forces from the Balkan region. So it looked as if the Romans were genuinely not interested in extending their power permanently into the region. What people didn't seem to understand was that the Romans now considered themselves to be the protectors of the Greeks. And they had really on hand a perpetual excuse for interference in Eastern affairs should they ever need one in the future. For the rest of his reign, Philip V towed the Roman line. He died in 179 BC and was succeeded by his son Perseus. Perseus took a more aggressive line with regard to Roman limitations on his abilities as a king. And so he began to behave slightly more aggressively towards the Greeks to his south and towards the Aegean Sea to his east. The Romans, again, I'm cutting the long story short here, the Romans initiated a series of diplomatic efforts to prevent him from acting. They failed, and ultimately the two sides slid into war almost out of apathy in 172 BC. This was the Third Macedonian War, and it lasted from 172 to 168 BC. After 3 years of not particularly effective maneuvering in northern Greece and Macedon, Roman legions and the Macedonian phalanx once more faced off over the plain of Pydna in northern Greece under the shadow of Mount Olympus, the mythical home of the Greek gods. The Roman phalanx charged across the plain and crashed into the Macedonian phalanx, charged across the plain and crashed into the Roman legions. The Roman general on the spot, a man called Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who was a friend of Polybius, a personal friend of Polybius, later commented that he'd never seen or heard anything more frightening in his life than that charge. 20,000 men with pikes several meters long, running, shouting at his army and smashing into the line with tremendous violence and force. Yet the Roman line held and in fact broke the Macedonian line and utterly defeated the phalanx in battle again. According to our figures, some 20,000 Macedonians were killed for the loss of only 100 or so Romans. It was an absolute rout. Well, after 3 interventions in Macedon, the Romans had finally had enough of the Antigonids, and they disbanded the Antigonid kingdom after the Third Macedonian War. This marks the end of the history of Antigonid Macedon. They created instead 4 independent republics out of the former territory of the Antigonid kingdom. These republics continued to exist until 150 BC, when a pretender, a man called Andriscus, appeared in the countryside, claiming to be the son of Perseus, the son of the last king of the Macedonians. Peasants and others flocked to his banner, and the Romans were forced yet again to send an army into Macedon in what's sometimes called the Fourth Macedonian War, to put down this rebellion. They had succeeded in doing so in 148 BC, and when they had done this, they decided that enough was enough, and they finally created, out of the former kingdom of Macedon, they created a new province, Macedonia, a new province of the Roman Empire. This then gave them their first permanent foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. As a footnote to all of these incidents, I should comment on a rather significant event, which is the Greeks, now seemingly somewhat disillusioned with the idea of what the Romans considered to be the Declaration of Free Greece, rose in rebellion, in really quite a pathetic rebellion, in 146 BC against the Romans. They were, of course, instantly subdued, but as an object lesson to the Greek world, the Romans destroyed the ancient Greek city of Corinth in this year, in 146 BC. This is significant because in the same year, if you recall, they had also razed Carthage to the ground. And many scholars, and indeed many Romans themselves, looking back on their history, regard this date, 146 BC, as a turning point in Roman imperialism. It seems that now the expansion of the Roman Empire becomes much more violent, much more aggressive than it had been in the past. The destruction of major urban centres, two of the major ancient urban centres of the Mediterranean, Carthage in the west, Corinth in the east, by the Romans in the same year, was a very significant event that sent ripples around the civilized world. So much then for the Macedonian campaigns, which stretched out from the First Macedonian War in 215, begun in 215, down to the middle of the 2nd century BC, and the final annexation of Macedon as a province, Macedonia. In order to trace the Roman conflict with the Seleucids, we have to backtrack chronologically slightly to the end of the Second Macedonian War. After this war, if you recall, the Romans had declared Greece a free country, and they had then withdrawn their troops from Greece. But one of the Greek leagues, the Northern League, the Aetolian League, were somewhat disillusioned with the reward that they received from the Romans for their resistance during the Second Macedonian War. They were expecting to get all of a certain area of northern Greece, but they only got a small section of it, and this irritated them. So they played the nationalistic card, and they began to foment unrest against the Romans among the Greeks. More particularly, they appealed to Antiochus III of Syria to come and assist them in freeing Greece from Roman oppression, as they put it. Antiochus sent over a smallish army into Greece in 192 BC, which immediately saw the Romans counter-mobilize, sending troops back into Greece after a 2-year absence, and the Seleucid force was thrown out of Greece by 190 BC. But the Romans were not finished. They wanted to teach Antiochus a lesson. They decided to invade the homeland of the Syrian kingdom itself. It didn't help, by the way, didn't help Antiochus's case with the Romans that he had in his court Hannibal, of all people, who was still there, which also raised for the Romans the rather ominous possibility of large, well-trained, well-equipped Hellenistic armies under the command of the best general that they'd ever faced in the field. So all of these motives combined encouraged the Romans to send an army into Asia Minor, the first Roman army, to cross into the ancient heartland of civilization, into Asia Minor, that is to say modern Turkey, in 190 BC. This army was quite small, about 30,000 men, and was under the control of Scipio Africanus, the defeater of Hannibal. Marching south, they finally encountered a vast Seleucid horde at the site of Magnesia in south-central Turkey, slightly inland. This Seleucid army numbered Well, the ancient sources tell us it numbered 150,000, but that's probably an enormous exaggeration. It certainly could have numbered as high as 80,000. We're after all dealing with an extremely rich and well-organized Hellenistic kingdom here. We know that the Seleucids could field very, very large armies, so a figure of 80,000 would be quite reasonable. So we're looking at the Romans being outnumbered close to 3 to 1 in this conflict. In addition, the Seleucids had elephants, but they also had a new armament that the Romans hadn't seen before, quite a vicious type of weapon, scythed chariots. These are chariots that have built into the axles and sticking out at the sides of the wheels large scythes, which obviously rotate with the axle, and when sent in large numbers into an infantry force can cause appalling devastation. Despite all this, the Roman army stood firm and prevailed at the Battle of Magnesia. This was an enormous shock to the Hellenistic world and to observers of the day, that the Seleucids, one of the superpowers of the day, could be humbled by a Roman force perhaps 3 times smaller than the Seleucid army was some statement as to Roman military superiority. Antiochus was humbled, humiliated, forced to pay a vast war indemnity because the Romans knew he could. They imposed a war indemnity of 15,000 talents of silver on him. That's an enormous sum of money, but no doubt somewhat extortionate, since the Romans knew the riches of the Seleucid kingdom. As a postscript, I should comment that from that point on, from the Battle of Magnesia onwards, Seleucid power was on the wane in the Near East. Eventually, by about 100 BC, the Seleucid kingdom had disappeared from the face of the earth, to be replaced by eastern peoples called the Parthians. We'll be hearing about these people again, because they were ultimately to be neighbours of the Roman Empire in the east. The Parthians had originally been subjects of the Seleucids, but they rose up and overthrew their former masters, seizing control of their kingdom around 100 BC. It's a longer process than that, but by 100 BC then, we have seen the demise of Seleucid Syria and Antigonid Macedon. 2 of the Hellenistic kingdoms have been humbled and have vanished from the face of the planet. As a result of this then, by about 160 or so BC, the Romans were in control of all of the Mediterranean lands. They took to calling the Mediterranean Sea Mare Nostrum, our sea. And in many ways it was a sort of Roman salt lake. For wherever the waters of the Mediterranean lapped upon the shores, either there was direct Roman control or indirect Roman influence. The size, the territorial size of the Roman Empire at this time in no way mirrors its hegemonic power over the Mediterranean lands. The Romans had only a handful of provinces. They had created a new province of Africa when they had destroyed Carthage in 146 BC. They had 2 provinces in Spain. They had a province in North Italy, Gallia Cisalpina. They had Sicily. They had Sardinia and Corsica. And they had Macedonia. Not very many. In terms of the actual territorial extent of the empire at this time, it's not really terribly large. But in terms of its influence, in terms of its hegemonic power, it is enormous. 2 incidents, I think, nicely illustrate this situation. In 168 BC, the Rhodians, allies of the Romans, attempted to negotiate, to act as mediators between the Romans and Perseus, king of Macedon, at that time involved in his war with the Romans in the Third Macedonian War. For whatever reason, the Romans were suspicious of this Rhodian action. It seems to us now, and it seems to many Romans at the time, to have been fairly innocuous and decent thing to do, but some members of the Roman nobility were very suspicious of what the Rhodians were trying to do. And as a result, the Romans destroyed Rhodes, not physically, but economically. They destroyed Rhodes with a single decree of the Senate. All they did was declare that a neighbouring port, the island of Delos, was immune from taxes. The source of Rhodian power had always been trade and levying, of course, port duties and taxes on trade ships that came through their harbours. But now they found all their former customers going to Delos instead. With a single decree, Rhodes was humbled and was no longer a major, even a minor player in the affairs of the Mediterranean. But I think even more colourful and more illustrative is the second incident. The successor to Antiochus III, the man defeated by the Romans at Magnesia, was Antiochus IV, king of Seleucid Syria. Something of his personality can be garnered from the fact that he called himself Antiochus IV Epiphanes, God on earth. The Seleucids had always been rivals of the Ptolemies in Egypt, and when internal disputes within the Ptolemaic dynasty offered an opportunity, Antiochus IV began to intervene. He intervened under the guise of assisting one of the two sides in the internal dynastic dispute within the Ptolemaic dynasty, but in fact, it looks like he had designs over control of, if not all of Egypt, certainly parts of it, especially the Nile Delta and the valuable city of Alexandria, a major port then and now on the Mediterranean coast. Antiochus, at the head of a large, no doubt spectacular military force, showed up in northern Egypt. The losing side in the dynastic dispute within the Ptolemaic dynasty appealed to assistance from Rome. The story goes that a Roman embassy was sent out to talk sense into Antiochus. The embassy was comprised of one man, Gaius Popilius Linas. He was an ex-consul and an old, wizened Roman senator. He appeared before Antiochus in front of their army, in front of Antiochus's army, dressed only in his toga and accompanied by his two attendants carrying the fasces, the signs of his imperium, the signs of his power, of his Roman authority. Here we have Antiochus in his full armour with his army behind him, facing a single aged Roman senator. Antiochus steps forward and stretches out his hand to greet the Roman senator, who simply looks back impassively and does not extend his hand in greeting. He orders Antiochus to return to Syria and will not shake his hand until he has agreed to do so. Antiochus is completely nonplussed, dithers, hesitates, at which point Popilius takes his staff and draws a circle in the sand around the king, walks around him with his staff, draws a circle in the sand, and says, "Unless you give me an answer to your to my demand that you return to Syria before you step outside that circle, consider yourself to be at war with Rome." Antiochus turned around and went back home. The mere threat of conflict with the legions was sufficient to turn back a significant armament, well-equipped, well-led, well-trained armament from the borders of Egypt. Egypt, after all, being a friend of the Roman people. This is true power. True power, as far as the Romans were concerned, and at this time, was not controlling territory. It was just this sort of incident, telling people what to do, and they obeyed. Truly, the rise of the Roman Empire in this period is a remarkable achievement. Polybius was entirely correct in stating that it was, up to that time, one of the most remarkable things that had ever happened in human history. The Romans had emerged in the space of merely 50 or 60 years, if we start with the end of the Punic War, and conquered all of the major superpowers of their day in battle, and now extended their hegemony in such a way over the empire, over the Mediterranean lands, that an unarmed Roman senator could turn back a Hellenistic king at the head of his troops. In the next lecture, we'll seek explanations for how and why this happened.